Our guest on this edition of CityWide is Manhattan Borough President Sott Stringer. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Rudy Giuliani ran on a slogan, one city, one standard. Mike Bloomberg prides himself on 5 borough plans. Every borough has its own delegation to the city council. Why do we need borough presidents?
Well, it's good to be on this show and get right into it. Part of what makes the city great is that we have always had an understanding that we are one city, but we're unique because we have these 5 separate entities called our boroughs. And it does make sense in a city of close to 9 million people that we do have a borough leader who can fight for services and hopes and dreams of people in the borough unique to that borough. And the charter has given us great responsibility over land use and zoning, over capital funding, but ultimately what makes the borough president a success story is that we all come from different places and work together to make New York City government more efficient and more responsible.
So in the recent flap over the blizzard of 2011, folks who lived outside of Manhattan felt that Manhattan had been treated specially. You could make the argument, I suppose, that the majority of jobs are in Manhattan, the majority of property tax revenues are from Manhattan, the majority of tourists come because of Manhattan. Should Manhattan get more services when it comes to things like sanitation and security?
At the risk of maybe offending my constituents, the answer is no. I think the great mistake in this Christmas blizzard debacle was the sense that all the other boroughs outside of Manhattan were being mistreated. And if you look at the tragedies, the child who didn't make it to Elmhurst Hospital in time, and that child passed away, the fact that in Crown Heights, a baby couldn't get to the hospital in time and also passed away. A man died on the subway at the age of 66, frozen to death. This was a real tragedy, not just for people in Brooklyn and Queens, for example, but also for those of us who live, and in my case, represent Manhattan. Anytime one borough gets hurt, the whole city gets hurt. And I think that the lesson here was that the Bloomberg administration in term 3 has to do a lot of retooling, I think.
Is Mike Bloomberg a good manager? Not just because of the snow, but there have been controversies over technology contracts that have gotten out of control, nonprofit organizations that seem to be patronage mills for local politicians. The federal government is now sued over how the city administers its Medicaid program. Is Mike Bloomberg a good manager?
I think Mike Bloomberg has been a very effective mayor. I think he's done a lot of great things for this city. But my job is not to judge the mayoralty in its totality. That will come from historians and people years from now, and that's appropriate. My job is to deal with the issues that are before us today. And when you look at the rollout of Chancellor Kathleen Black and how that misfired both to parents and to teachers and to the city of New York, following the city time overspending and ultimate criminal investigation that's going on. I think Comptroller Lou gets a lot of credit for staying on that. And then the snowstorm where we found out not just that we couldn't manage a major snowstorm, but there was no chain of command in the mayor's absence. The fact that he was away, I have no problem with that, but none of us, including those who represent big boroughs, didn't know who to call. Who was at City Hall in a major snowstorm? God forbid this had been a terrorist attack or another natural disaster. Where would the chain of command be? So first and foremost, no, the mayor doesn't have a right to keep his private schedule private. New Yorkers have a right and a need to know where the mayor is at all times. I know he's in touch with his deputies. I know he's working. But the bottom line is, we got to know where the leaders of our government, in a city of 9 million people, the most important city in the world, should have a chain of command, and that is something we must do.
You mentioned the appointment of the new schools chancellor. You've initiated a program to get people more involved in the schools. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Over the last few years as borough president, we've issued a number of important reports on school overcrowding and then created war rooms to make sure that in some neighborhoods we actually figured out a way to create more seats, class seats, to reduce overcrowding and to find space for public school kids. everybody knows that when you can't meet that demand, parents take their children and their tax dollars and flee the city as if they were never here because they want to make sure their children have an opportunity for education. But I also think that part of the mistake or the problems over the last few years as it relates to the Department of Education is that parents feel shut out of the system, feel shut out of the process. They can't give their opinions. And Joe Klein, in his exit interview, said basically that if he could do it all over again, he would have been spending more time negotiating and navigating the community or the parent community. So I created an online survey, surveyed 1,000 people, teachers, parents, principals, and asked them what they thought the priorities for the new chancellor ought to be. And what we found was some very interesting information. People are concerned about overcrowding. Principals are concerned about layoffs and budgeting. And almost every category that participated said, we want to have a say in the system. We want the chancellor to listen. We want to feel that our concerns or our ideas are part of the discussion. And I'm a big supporter of mayoral control, voted for mayoral control when I was in the legislature. But I think now Kathy Black has a real opportunity to take a look at this survey and then listen to what people have to say and help others, teachers and principals, guide her as she makes some very important decisions for the 1.1 million school children.
You've also tried to, I think, incorporate this notion of inclusion in how you've approached some of what I might call the day in and day out work of your office with the community boards and how you look at development projects and the like. And tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, it goes to your first question, why do we need borough presidents? And part of what we've created in Manhattan is a merit-based system of community board appointment. We have created a graduate student internship program where young urban planners now work in communities to assist neighborhoods with economic development, land use decisions. It's been an amazing opportunity for the Borough President's office to work in every community fighting for the whole borough. And these are unique ways in which we connect to the city, unique ways we help neighborhoods. And part of our community board reform process has been to make the community boards partner with developers and city-sponsored projects to actually get things accomplished. And I'm very proud of this effort, and that's why you need a borough president, because sometimes what is working in one community has to transcend into the next neighborhood. And you do have a different perspective representing a whole borough than just a local community district.
Give us an example of where this has worked well and maybe one where it hasn't worked so well.
I think when the expansion of Columbia University, which pitted Columbia against the West Harlem community, there was a lot of bad blood between Columbia and Morningside Heights because of things that occurred, evictions and the demonstrations against the war, the gymnasium fight at Columbia. You remember this? Anybody at that time period remembers? So this was a real concern for the neighborhood. Columbia needed to expand because we needed to create those jobs and attract intellectual capital from all over the world going to our universities. And I was able to negotiate a deal that got Columbia their needed expansion, but also, more importantly, now we are undergoing with the mayor and with Amanda Burden a historic rezoning of the West Harlem community beyond the Columbia footprint. And that's because we work with the community and our urban planners. And we were able to fashion an agreement that said, yes, you get to expand, but this community gets protected. So the long-term residents of West Harlem right now, they're actually working on this rezoning. They're going to tell the city what kind of neighborhood they want. And that is the kind of work that we do. We also did this with Fordham University on the Upper West Side. We knew that Fordham had to expand, but they also had to expand in a way that worked for the West Side community. And we were able to fashion that agreement. And now our biggest challenge is in the Village with NYU and their huge expansion program and the needs of the historic district of the West Village and the whole village, in fact. And I'm working now to negotiate on those issues as well. That is the role of our office, which is to negotiate and get things accomplished.
Isn't it, though, the nature of community politics that if you ask most people what kind of neighborhood that they want the kind of neighborhood that they have now. And change is threatening to a lot of people. In Harlem and Washington Heights and other areas that have been neglected for generations, all of a sudden new folks start moving in, and the folks who live there just assume that this is going to be bad for them, or in fact just makes them uncomfortable.
Well, sometimes it does turn out bad for long-term residents of our neighborhood as it improves. So here's what the problem is. You live in a community that no one else wanted to move into. You help with your neighbors to build the schools, the daycare centers, you help start the small businesses, you fight through the crack epidemic, you work hard with your sweat equity to transform this neighborhood. At the moment that it's transformed, developers and speculators come in and market the neighborhood in a way that brings new people with a lot of wealth to a community, and suddenly you find yourself having to move. That's not right. Obviously, the skylines in the city have to change, and they should, they must, but we have to make sure that with development also comes protection for the existing.
Or at least the sense that people got their say.
And that people have a fight to stay in their community. I actually find that people love change and progress as long as they feel that they're not going to be forced out. They may choose to move out, but there's that distinction. So in Harlem, for example, which is a wonderfully diverse community, and there have been some positive changes with gentrification, but they've also had to watch billboards go up that say in South Harlem, hey, welcome to Soha. And that takes away the history of that amazing community. So we have to have zoning and planning that is balanced. And when you can create the energy of a changing community with new people moving in, new immigrants from different countries coming to your community, and at the same time, you can create a rezoning that lets longtime residents stay. That's the New York that we are building, and that's what makes it so challenging as borough president, but also challenging for any city administration.
We're going to continue our conversation with Borough President Sott Stringer when CityWide continues right after this.
Secondhand smoke kids breathe in smoke that can have as much nicotine and carbon monoxide as what's inhaled by a smoker. About half of secondhand smoke kids have cancer-causing chemicals in their bodies. They suffer more frequent and severe asthma attacks, and some studies even show a link to learning problems. Don't raise a secondhand smoke kid. Quit smoking today. For help, call 311.
Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Manhattan Borough President Sott Stringer. You've also tried to use your office for, I won't say as an incubator, but to come up with projects that you can try in one place and then see whether they're worth expanding. I know that environmental education is something that you particularly focused on, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about that program.
Well, this is what's great about this job. You can look at a problem and then have the resources to actually mobilize a community. And we did that for a number of years now in El Barrio in East Harlem, where the asthma rate among kids is the highest in the nation, real issues relating to diabetes. And we started a program called Go Green East Harlem, where we actually went to the neighborhood and said, what can we do to create a more environmentally friendly community? And the results have been amazing. We built a standalone asthma center with Mayor Bloomberg. Thousands of kids have been tested. First time a center like this has existed anywhere in Manhattan. We have planted more trees thanks to Bette Midler and the Restoration Project. We have a green building protocol, so developers come into East Harlem now. We need to see a gold plan, a silver lead plan. This is the kind of way we're treating the community. And finally, we're working with the small businesses and opening up more farmers markets. This has led us not only to create sustainability in East Harlem, but through this experience, we're now dealing with food procurement and bringing fresh vegetables, not just to East Harlem, but creating programs around the city. 800,000 people live in food deserts, not food deserts, food deserts, where they can't access healthy food. And I think the report that we issued, NYC Food, is the standard, the gold standard, by which our city administration should work to create a new economy around the food supply and to build healthy communities.
Do I remember correctly you did a cookbook? Was that
We did a cookbook. It was called the Go Green East Harlem Cookbook. Recipes from business owners and people who live in public housing, photographs by students from the International Center of Photography. Best-selling cookbook, well, okay, not the best-selling cookbook, but what a great pride that community felt when it was reported that we published this cookbook in all the newspapers and radio and TV stations. It gave the neighborhood a sense that politicians were not just coming for photo ops, but we were actually creating a green standard in that community. And the best thing you'd appreciate is when we launched Go Green and published the cookbook, I was doing block parties, saying hello to people, and I was still relatively new, and a person turned to me and said, "That's Mr. Green, that's Mr. Green." And I said, oh no, they're going to vote for Mark Green for Borough President, he's not running. So they understand that when they look at our office in many of our communities, they view us as the green sustainability programs that they needed so badly.
You have limited resources as Borough President. We're in a serious financial crisis at the city and the state level. There isn't a lot of new money around. So how do you pick how can you have an impact on things if you can't really apply new resources to dealing with them?
I think you have to be creative, but not everything is spending money. I mean, you mentioned the slush fund scandals in the city council and that way of taking care of problems. I mean, that's the old way. We operate in a different way. We don't think of money as the only criteria. We think about coming up with programs that talk about, for example, our food sustainability issues, or creating a bank-on program to find out in Manhattan who the unbanked people in the borough are, and then working with 9 banks to create an education campaign and coming up with a financial product that poor people can use to get a bank account. This is not about big spending, this is about smart policies.
Your office has some discretionary money that you can give out to organizations. How do you do that?
We have a very collaborative internal process where we balance the geography needs and the making sure that everybody gets a fair share of what's very little money. But we have people in the whole office participate. Our community affairs people, land use people, our budget director is consultative, and we don't really use it for political means because it doesn't work for us in that way. I do think that member items play a role. I think we have a system where favorite people get more money than others. I don't think that's right. So I think we have to either mend this system or end it. And we're going to be working on those issues in the coming years.
So the city has some big issues that it has to deal with. You touched on one in terms of health needs and food policy. But there isn't money for spending. And so when you take an area like infrastructure, for example, transportation, environmental protection, we're at the limit pretty much of the amount that the city can borrow. Debt service on the city capital program is now 16% of its operating budget. It was only 12% just a decade ago. So where are we going to get the money from?
Well, I think when you think about infrastructure, we have to tell people, what does that mean? So we need to replace the Verrazano Bridge, right? But we can't afford to do that. What we can do, though, is hear what President Obama is doing and then take advantage of it, which is starting to talk about a national infrastructure bank. I want to create a statewide infrastructure bank, and we're working with Congressman Steve Israel from Long Island, who has really championed this issue. We're going to be setting up a conference in New York in March where we're going to bring experts in the field to think about infrastructure in today's economy. And I do think there's a possibility to access a national infrastructure bank to pay for roads and bridges and mass transit, and we can do it on a state level. And that's something that we're exploring in our office right now, and Congressman Israel has been a champion on this issue.
How do you cut the cost of government? I've spoken to leaders, Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch, Mayor Ed Koch, who talk about the sense of shared sacrifice that leadership developed in the fiscal crisis in the 1970s, which they say is lacking today. On the other hand, I talked to labor leaders like Mike Fishman from 32BJ, and he says that shared sacrifice is nothing but a code word for taking it out on the backs of working people and people who really can't afford to move backwards economically. So given the fact that we don't seem to have an appetite for raising taxes, and given the fact that the cost of government continues to spiral and the city's going to be facing multi-billion-dollar deficits for the foreseeable future, particularly if the state cuts aid, what's got to give?
If you think about the last fiscal crisis, the big one in the 1970s, 1975, Ed Koch is absolutely right. There was a governor back then, Hugh Carey, who worked with a financial genius in Felix Rohatyn, who worked with Lou Rudin in the real estate industry, Al Schenker in the United Federation of Teachers, Victor Gottbaum in District Council 37. I'm not sure they talked about shared sacrifice. What they did was sit around a table and say, how are we going to get out of this? And so Rohatyn and the banks set up the Municipal Assistance Corporation. Lou Rudin said real estate industry will prepay taxes. The unions took their own pension money and invested in these bonds. Nobody knew anyone was going to buy these bonds. And everybody just put it all on the table. Now, I don't know if that's called shared sacrifice, foolishness, but
Well, it was also a crisis because the city was going to run out of money.
But we are now at that same juncture. We have a $9 billion deficit in the state, a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit in the city. Now's the time to put the politics aside and sit down and have that conversation that no one has been willing to have for quite some time. And I'm going to do everything I can to get those leaders in a room to start thinking about it, because going forward, there's a lot that we can do to rebound this economy, but at the end of the day, labor has to talk to business, real estate has to talk to the counterparts, and we've got to figure this out, because that's what's at stake in the city. And if we're going to go to the federal government, as we learned in the 1970s, they will not listen to us unless we have our act together. That was the problem back in the 70s. We couldn't get a financial package because we couldn't get our house in order. And I have great promise and hope that Andrew Cuomo can begin to set that tone that we can all follow and make this state and this city the same economically vibrant state it was in a city over the last few decades.
So his supporters are now rounding up $10 million for a media campaign to back his policy initiatives. Is that the way public policy gets decided now? Is it people sitting quietly around the table? Is it the media campaigns and organizing in the streets? Does it require both? How do you get anything done?
Well, in this democracy, TV ads and street organizing, well, that's fair game. I do think at the end of the day, when you close the door, we all realize that we have a like-minded agenda. I think that will ultimately become the standard, and that's what I'm hoping for. In the meantime, I do think that we should have a discussion of finances and put everything on the table and let the public hear from both sides. Ultimately, the voters out there elect us to make tough decisions, but we're also responsible for those decisions. I hope that through this third term that Bloomberg has and the new term that Andrew Cuomo has, let's get this discussion started and let's start solving these problems and stop trying to win the news cycle day. And let's try to create a real solving the problem of this structural deficit that's going to eat away at us. And Ken, the difference between the 1970s and today is that way back when, ultimately business had to be in New York, right? You had to do it here because you couldn't do it anywhere else. That's not true today. New York has to aggressively market ourselves as a place where people will want to come here, continue to be this magnet city, but we also have to make sure that we can get the next generation of ideas and business leaders here, and we need a strong union labor workforce, the men and women who make a big difference in this city.
My thanks to Manhattan Borough President Sott Stringer. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us on this edition of CityWide.